The candles were nearly spent when he confessed. His handwriting trembled, the ink blotting against the coarse French paper as if the words themselves resisted being recorded. They do not leave me when they die. Their voices cling. They whisper in the walls, in the rafters, inside my skull. For nearly a century and a half, this confession has remained buried, spoken of only in fragments, a name whispered in medical corridors, a rumor among archivists who stumble upon misplaced files. Yet the doctor himself lived, worked, and walked among his peers in France, in the very heart of 1886, a year of scientific progress, of surgical advancement, and of quiet horror. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The era of silence and scalpel. To understand him, we must step back into the year 1886. Medicine was a battlefield where science warred with death daily. Surgeons still wore blood-stained coats as badges of honor. Ether hung in the air like a fog, masking screams as knives cut flesh. The wards smelled of boiled linen, carbolic acid, and something deeper, rot, that no antiseptic could fully chase away. France, proud in its pursuit of reason, was equally drenched in superstition. Villages whispered of curses, of saints who healed with touch, and of doctors who sometimes did more harm than good. It was here, in this atmosphere of progress shadowed by dread, that Dr. Émile Letourneau practiced. A man of stern features and hollow eyes, Émile was respected for his precision. He studied under Parisian masters, memorized anatomical charts, and taught himself to ignore the pleading faces of families. Yet even in his most successful surgeries, he felt something unfinished, something pressing against the silence of his operating room. At first he dismissed it as guilt, the gnawing voice of conscience reminding him of those he had lost upon the table. But in his journal he noted a peculiar detail. The voices did not sound like his own thoughts. They were external, faint, and strangely articulate. He wrote, "I heard Madame Rousseau after she expired. She said my name. She begged me to tell her son where her letters were hidden. I did not know such a son existed." When he later inquired discreetly, the son confirmed both his existence and the letters, long concealed beneath a drawer. The detail left Émile shaken. He had not been guessing. He had heard. A man haunted by his work. Each night after the lamps were extinguished, Émile lingered in his office, his stethoscope lying unused beside stacks of medical notes. He began to scribble furiously, not about arteries or infection, but about voices, names, pleas, locations. Some begged for forgiveness. Some demanded he warn their children. A few whispered dreadful secrets, confessions of crimes, of betrayals, of affairs never uncovered. He described the tones of the voices, raspy, trembling, childlike, shrill. All were unmistakably human. But Émile was no mystic. He considered himself a man of science. He questioned whether fatigue, laudanum, or exhaustion warped his senses. He considered madness, even wrote the word in his journal, démence. Yet the precision of the whispers unnerved him. He could verify too many, and so in private he tested them. When a patient passed beneath his scalpel, he would sit in the stillness of the room, listening. Sometimes he heard nothing but the drip of water in the basin. Other times, often when his hands still trembled with failure, the whisper came, clearer now, more insistent. His assistant, Jacques Fournier, recalled years later in a letter to his nephew, "I swore once I heard it, a voice faint as if behind glass. I thought my master had spoken aloud, but when I turned, his lips were pressed thin and white." The growing terror. By spring of that year, Émile's journals reveal a descent into terror. He described awakening to whispers in his bedchamber, hearing the creak of floorboards though no one entered. Patients long buried spoke to him still. Some warned him of things to come, storms, fires, even deaths of the living. He began to wear thick cloth over his ears in the operating theater. His colleagues laughed, assuming it was eccentricity or affectation. They did not know he was trying to silence the dead. The tension grew unbearable. At meals he startled at shadow. In church, he trembled when prayers for the departed were spoken, as though each invocation pulled more whispers into his skull. His handwriting degenerated, notes filled with blots, as though his hand could not keep pace with the torrent of voices. "They crowd me now, not one but many, a choir of the condemned. Some call me savior, others curse me. I can endure it no longer." The final journals. In October 1886, his entries grew frantic. Colleagues noted his eyes sinking further, his hands trembling, though no fever marked him. He ceased operations altogether, fearing that each incision brought him closer to the whispers. The last legible line, found in a notebook with cracked binding, read simply, "If you inherit my burden, forgive me." The following week, Emil was discovered in his quarters, his ears stuffed with wax and cloth, blood trickling where he had pressed too hard. He was not yet dead, but raving, striking his head against the wall to drive out the voices. He never returned to practice. His belongings were dispersed, his notes reportedly destroyed, yet rumors persisted that some fragments survived, that assistants carried them away, and that among physicians in France, a quiet dread remained, an inheritance none wished to claim. Why this story endures? Skeptics argue it was madness. Historians call it a symptom of guilt. A doctor too weighed by the lives he could not save, yet the testimonies of families, confirmations of details Emil could not have known remain troubling. And so, his case lingers in archives and whispers, the surgeon who heard his patients even after their final breath. But was he truly cursed? Or did he discover something beyond our grasp? Something that brushes against the edges of both medicine and the grave? This is where our manuscript begins. The archives say little, but if one follows the faint trail of correspondence, one uncovers fragments, letters, diary excerpts, even whispers preserved in parish record. These fragments form the skeleton of what became Emil Letourneau's earliest descent into the unexplainable. It began as so many things do, with denial. The first whispers. Emil's journals mentioned the death of Madame Rousseau more than once. She was a widow in her late 50s, brought into his care after an infection had ravaged her lungs. He wrote in his clinical notes, "Patient expired on table, cause advanced sepsis, beyond surgical aid." Yet in the private journal hidden within his desk, the entry is long. "No sooner had her eyes glazed than I heard her speak. Her lips did not move. She said, 'Tell Anne-Marie.' The drawer." The words were near, as though whispered against my ear. I recoiled, struck my instruments to the floor. Jacques asked what startled me, but I could not answer. Days later, Emile visited her home under the guise of returning condolences. There her son Anne-Marie confirmed the existence of hidden letters tucked within an oak writing desk. Emile did not dare reveal how he knew. He left swiftly, shaken, his hands trembling as though still pressed against a corpse. Letters that should not exist. By the spring of 1886, other whispers followed. A boy of 12, Pierre Lecroix, died under his knife after a failed abdominal surgery. Emile claimed the voice was faint but persistent, repeating a single phrase, "Not the well, the pond." The words haunted him until weeks later, Pierre's grieving father confided that the family had always told the child his mother drowned herself in the well years prior. Emile, pale and unsteady, asked only a single question. "Are you certain it was the well?" The man insisted. But when floods swelled the nearby river, the ground gave way, uncovering bones in a silted pond, half a mile from the well. The discovery was whispered through the town, though no official inquiry followed. Emile wrote in his journal that night, "I begin to suspect this is no invention of my mind. I fear what this gift demands of me." The weight of secrets. Colleagues at the hospital began to notice his distraction. Dr. Moreau, a contemporary in Paris, later wrote in correspondence, "Letourneau seemed burdened by something invisible. He would fall silent in the midst of conversations, staring as though at a voice only he could hear. Meanwhile his journals filled with details, not medical but personal, names of lovers whispered by dying men, hidden debts confessed in tones of panic, requests to protect children from cruel fathers. Each revelation was accompanied by Emile's growing fear, for if the dead spoke truth, then silence itself had been breached. The assistant's testimony. The assistant, Jacques Fournier, remained loyal, though disturbed. Years later, when writing to his nephew, he recounted a particular incident. "During an operation upon a soldier's leg, I swear I heard a murmur, though the man was already gone. It was as if two voices spoke at once, the breathless rattle of the dying and some faint echo from beyond. I turned to my master, but he had frozen pale as wax. He muttered, 'You hear it too.' From that day, I feared him as much as I pitied him." If Jacques truly shared the experience, then Emile's torment was no delusion confined to one mind. It was something that bled into reality, witnessed by more than one soul. Whispers at night. By midsummer, the phenomenon no longer confined itself to the theater. Emile reported hearing voices even in his chambers, long after burial of the patients. Some spoke kindly, others in rage, but all knew details only the deceased could have carried. He described lying in bed, the moonlight casting sharp shadows across his room, when a voice rasped near his ear. "You let me bleed, Emile. My daughter waits." He bolted upright, clutching his stethoscope, as though it might banish the sound. But the room was empty, the air still. His handwriting the following day was jagged, urgent. "They follow me now. They are not bound to their flesh." The growing divide. Among his colleagues, Emile's reputation wavered. Some admired his skill but whispered about his declining composure. Others mocked his silence at dinner, his habit of pressing fingers to his ears, his sudden absences from rounds. To families, however, he became both terrifying and revered. He seemed to know too much. Details of inheritance disputes, secret affairs, hidden crime. Mothers whispered that he was cursed, yet others prayed for his insight, hoping he might reveal messages from lost loved ones. In this way, Emile straddled two worlds, medicine and the grave, and with each passing day, the boundary thinned. The edge of madness. In late September, he wrote the most chilling line yet recorded. "I fear not the dead, who whisper, but the moment when they may shout." He confessed he had begun stuffing wax in his ears at night, yet still the whispers penetrate. He contemplated abandoning medicine entirely, yet the weight of duty pressed against him. If he alone could hear the truths of the dead, was it not his obligation to bear them? And yet he dreaded the answer. What began as faint guilt had become a dreadful inheritance, but the worst was yet to come. The dead did not speak only of themselves. As the year deepened into autumn, their whispers began to pull Emile Lutorno into the hidden rot of families he had once thought respectable. It was no longer the failing lungs, the ruptured stomachs, the hemorrhages that haunted him. It was what lingered behind, the tangled secrets of bloodlines, inheritances and sins. The widow's plea. In October, Emile recorded the death of Madame Durand, a matron known for her charitable giving. She had fallen ill with a wasting sickness. When she passed, Emile expected only silence. Instead, the voice came strong, clear, as though she lay beside him. "My son must not have it." The box, beneath the hearth. Emile stumbled, nearly striking the lamp from the table. That evening he wrote, "I do not know if I am confessor or thief, yet the dead make me both." 2 days later, the Durand household erupted in whispers of scandal. A servant had discovered, tucked beneath a loose brick in the hearth, a box of letters and receipts. They revealed debts, betrayals, even evidence of fraud. The eldest son, once the rightful heir, was disinherited. Though Emile told no one, the family glared at him during the funeral, as though suspecting he had meddled. He wondered if the dead used him to punish the living, or if they merely wished to be remembered. The boy in the attic, Jacques, ever loyal, recorded a moment that left him sleepless. A child patient, Julian, died during a fever that no laudanum or poultice could touch. As Emile prepared the body, a whisper filled the air, soft as lullaby. "They keep him upstairs. Do not let him starve." Emile staggered. Jacques, confused, asked what troubled him. Without answering, Emile fled to the boy's home. He demanded entry, claiming urgent medical business. The family resisted, pale and trembling, until at last he forced his way into the attic. There, hidden beneath blankets and straw, was a second child, Julian's younger brother, thin as a wraith, bones pressing through skin. The parents had concealed him, fearing rumors of madness, for the boy's eyes did not move in unison, and his speech was broken. Emile carried the child down in his arms, furious, trembling, yet when he glanced toward the stairwell, he swore he heard a small voice whisper, "Mercy." The parish priest. Whispers reached even the church. Father Chabert, the parish priest, had long condemned Emile for his obsession with scalpel and science. Yet one evening, as the priest lay dying of a stroke, Emile was summoned to his bedside. The family insisted he give comfort, though no cure remained. When the priest's last breath rattled through the chamber, Emile braced himself, and indeed, the whisper came, harsh and bitter, "The confessional." Behind the wall. Later, carpenters repairing the confessional discovered hollowed panels, stuffed with coins, bribes and indulgences taken in secret. The scandal was buried, yet whispers rippled through the town. Emile no longer felt like a physician. He felt like an intruder into the sins of every soul that passed through his hands. The family journals. Emil's own family bore shadows as well. In late October, he visited his aging aunt, who had raised him after his parents' death. She lay frail, her breath ragged. As she passed, he pressed her hand, whispering prayers. But the voice that answered was not the aunt he knew. "Your father did not drown." The words stopped his breath. He had been told since childhood that his father perished in the Loire River. The whisper continued, broken by silence. "He was taken, buried, not water-earth." Emil wrote that night, his script unsteady. "If this is true, then my life is built upon a lie. I must know." From that day he began to search family records, parish logs, even old debtors' accounts. What he found hinted at disputes, quarrels and vanished sums, but no clear truth surfaced. His father's death remained an unsteady shadow, a town afraid. By November, the whispers had spread beyond rumor. Villagers spoke of the doctor who heard the dead. Some feared him, calling him a curse. Others begged for his help, clutching his hands, demanding messages from lost children or wives. At funerals, his presence unsettled mourners, for they suspected he heard what they could not. In taverns, men spat at his name, while women crossed themselves as he passed. Yet Emil continued, compelled. Each whisper was a puzzle, a command. He no longer chose to listen, he was bound. The whisper that lingered, among all, one voice haunted him most. The soldier whose body he failed to save on the table had whispered, "Do not trust Jacques." Emil dismissed it at first. His assistant had been his only companion, his shield against madness. Yet the soldier's words returned at night, repeated in different cadences, as though insisting. He began to study Jacques, to watch his movements, to question his loyalty. Did Jacques betray him, or were the dead themselves liars, sowing seeds of paranoia? Emil wrote, "If I cannot trust the living, and I cannot silence the dead, then where am I to stand?" Closing shadows. By winter's approach, Emil was a man divided. He moved among families who despised or revered him, yet at night he returned to an empty chamber filled with voices. He no longer slept in peace. He no longer trusted his own bloodline. Beneath it all, the suspicion grew. If the dead carried secrets of families, then what greater secrets might they yet reveal? Secrets that reached beyond one town, one century. The voices were only beginning to demand more. By December of 8, Emile Letourneau was scarcely the same man his colleagues had once known. His hair, once neatly trimmed, grew wild. His eyes sank deeper, rimmed with sleepless shadows. The townsfolk whispered that he looked less like a doctor, and more like a mourner, who had never left the graveyard. Yet it was not his appearance alone that disturbed them. It was the steady stream of secrets that seemed to emerge wherever he lingered. The whispers had grown bolder. They no longer confined themselves to final breaths, or the hush of midnight. They began to intrude at unexpected times in the marketplace, in the church pew, in the very corridors of the hospital, and with each revelation, the boundary between medicine and madness eroded. The merchant's house. The death of Monsieur Charbonneau, a wealthy wine merchant, would be remembered as a turning point. He died suddenly after a rupture in his gut, leaving behind a widow draped in black silk and a house thick with whispers of inheritance. Emile, already trembling from sleepless nights, claimed the man's voice followed him into the street. Cellar, not wine, bones. At first he dismissed it, yet the image gnawed at him. 2 days later, unable to resist, he returned to the Charbonneauist. With Jacques at his side, he descended into the cellar. Behind the stacked barrels, concealed beneath loose stones, they uncovered not bottles but a shallow grave. A skeleton, bound with cord, lay curled in the damp earth. The jaw hung open as though in silent scream. When authorities were summoned, the widow fainted at the sight. Whispers swirled that the merchant had silenced a rival, or worse, a mistress. No one dared confirm, but the town's eyes turned sharply toward Emile. How had he known? The winter choir. The doctor began to hear multiple voices at once. At night, they filled his room with a low chorus, overlapping and indistinguishable. Sometimes they argued, sometimes they wept, and sometimes they laughed. A hollow, mirthless sound that drove Emile to press pillows against his ears until dawn. In his journal he scrawled, "I am their instrument. They choose what to reveal, and I am powerless to resist." He grew reluctant to enter the hospital, yet when summoned he obeyed. The dead seemed to know when he tried to resist. Their whispers grew sharper, more punishing, whenever he ignored them. The child's confession. A fevered girl named Elise passed in the ward one bitter evening. Her voice came not as a whisper but as a sob. "My uncle, he hurt me. Tell Maman." Emil froze, the lantern flickering in his hand. He wanted to dismiss it as fevered imagination, yet the words returned night after night. At last, against his better judgment, he visited Elise's mother. When he stammered the words, the woman went pale. She said nothing, but 2 days later her brother fled town. No one saw him again. This incident spread like fire. Some praised Emil as a vessel of truth. Others cursed him, swearing he sowed discord in families. But all agreed, where he walked, ruin followed. Jacques under watch. The warning whispered by the dead soldier still lingered. "Do not trust Jacques." Emil could not rid himself of the phrase. He began recording Jacques' movements, noting his absences, his muttered prayers. He scrutinized every glance, every hesitation, yet Jacques remained steadfast. He cleaned instruments, comforted patients, and never once abandoned his master. Still suspicion gnawed at Emil. He wrote, "Perhaps loyalty itself is the mask of betrayal." The rift between them widened, though Jacques swore he had done nothing to deserve it. The whispers had planted their poison. The feast of the dead. On All Souls' Day, Emil attended Mass. The church was packed, candles burning thick with smoke, the chant of prayers filling the vaulted stone. But amid the sacred words, he heard others, faint voices pressed close to his ear, layered upon the chants, confessions of theft, lust, envy, murder. He clutched the pew, gasping, while the congregation sang. Later he stumbled into the street, whispering, "The church itself is a tomb. They speak from beneath the stones." It was then he began avoiding the parish entirely. Faith had no refuge for him, only more voice. The case of Marguerite. A young woman named Marguerite died in childbirth. As Emil wiped the blood from his hands, her whisper rose, fragile but insistent. "He is not the father." Her husband, seated in the hall, wept with grief. Emil stared at him with horror, unable to speak. But the words echoed long after the burial, staining his conscience. He wondered how many lives rested on lies, and how many whispers would drag them to the surface. The breaking point. By year's end, Emil's journals read more like confessions than records. "They do not rest. They do not forgive. They pull me deeper into their quarrels, their betrayals, their sins. I am no longer surgeon, but scribe, and still they demand more." He confessed to hearing his own father's voice again, this time in dreams, always the same refrain, "Find me, find me." The line between his patient's secrets and his own family's shadow was blurring. The voices were tightening their grip, weaving him into a net of truth, too heavy for any man to bear. And with the new year approaching, he feared the worst was still to come. By the first months of 1887, Emile Letourneau's world had narrowed to two obsessions: the voices of the dead, and the written traces they demanded of him. His study, once a place of surgical notes and anatomical sketches, had become a vault of confession. Stacks of journals filled the shelves, each leather spine buckled, each page blotched with hurried ink. He no longer wrote of arteries or gangrene, but of whispers, names, and the dreadful truths the living never uttered aloud. The journals were not tidy records. They were frantic, overlapping accounts, medical precision entwined with fragments of voices, as if Emile sought to prove, through sheer detail, that he was not mad. The anatomy of a whisper. Emile attempted to dissect the phenomenon as he would a bot. He began timing the moments between death and the first murmur. He noted the tone, the clarity, even the dialect of the voices. On average, he wrote, the first whisper arrives within 4 breaths of silence. Most are faint, as though spoken through cloth, but some are piercing, like a cry pressed to the ear. They know what they should not know. They recall what I have never seen. This is not memory, it is presence. He described variations, the lingering, voices that haunted for days after death, the sudden, a sharp cry at the moment of passing, never to be heard again, the persistent choir, overlapping whispers, often incoherent, as though the dead gathered together. These classifications filled pages, yet each left him more trouble, for he could catalogue the dead, but he could not silence them. The wax and the stethoscope. To test his own sanity, Emile devised crude experiments. He stuffed his ears with wax, then leaned close to corpses. The voices still reached him, clear as bell. He pressed his stethoscope against his skull, as if the instrument might capture the whispers. but only silence answered. At one point, Jacques discovered him with needles piercing his own ears, blood streaking his neck. Emile muttered, "If I rupture the passage, perhaps I shall be free." Jacques wrenched the instruments away, horrified. The journals grew darker after that incident. Emile began to suspect the voices were not confined to sound at all. "They are not in the ear," he wrote, "but in the marrow." The case of Dr. Moreau. In January, Emile traveled briefly to Paris to consult his former mentor, Dr. Auguste Moreau, a physician of great repute. He carried with him several journals, intending to confess, but when he attempted to speak, a whisper cut across his thoughts. "Do not trust him." Emile faltered, sweat pouring down his brow. Moreau placed a hand on his shoulder, asking gently if he was unwell. Emile stammered something about fatigue, and left without revealing his birthdays. Later, Moreau was accused of malpractice in a case involving a wealthy aristocrat's death. Whispers of negligence, bribery, even deliberate poisoning swirled. Emile shuddered when he read the news. The dead had known. The Journal of the Forsaken. Among his notes lies a page unlike the others, its margins torn, ink spattered as though written in fever. On it he listed 30 names. Beside each he scribbled a single phrase: Madame Rousseau, the drawer; Pierre Lacroix, not the wet; Charbonneau, bones in cellar; Elise, my uncle; Chabert, coins in confessional; Marguerite, not the father. At the bottom his hand faltered, yet one last line is legible: my father, not water, earth. This list, preserved only in copies, became known among archivists as the Journal of the Forsaken. Some dismissed it as ravings, others whispered it was the purest evidence that Emile spoke with the dead. Jacques and the fire. The strain between Emile and Jacques reached breaking point when the assistant discovered the journals stacked in the study. Horrified by their content, Jacques urged him to burn them. "These are not records," he pleaded. "They are invitations. You are feeding." Emile refused, but one night, Jacques attempted it himself. He carried several volumes to the hearth, striking the flint. Before the fire caught, Emile burst into the room, seizing the journals from the flames with bare hands. His palms blistered, yet he clutched the books to his chest, screaming, "They are mine. They will not let me forget." That night, Jacques wrote to a cousin that he feared for his master's life and perhaps his soul. The silence that never came, despite his catalogues and experiments. Emile realized a dreadful truth. The whispers did not cease with burial, nor with burning, nor with prayer. They lingered as though tethered not to flesh, but to him. "I am their archive," he wrote. "If I silence myself, who will they torment next?" This thought chilled him most of all, for the last words of his final intact journal suggest he believed the burden could be passed, an inheritance not of blood, but of touch, of knowledge, of proximity to death, toward madness. By February, Emile no longer spoke in full sentences. Colleagues described him as muttering constantly, as though in dialogue with unseen companions. He carried journals under his coat, clutching them close, scribbling even while walking the street. One witness recalled, he paused at a lamppost scrawling furiously, then laughed aloud, as if at some private jest. "I crossed myself and did not look back." The doctor who once healed bodies was now physician only to the dead, and yet even in the depths of madness, he continued his work. The whispers, after all, were leading him somewhere darker, somewhere he would not return from. By the spring of 1887, Émile Letourneau had crossed a threshold from which few could return. His journals, once merely the records of a troubled physician, now read like a blend of autopsy reports and occult grimoires. He had ceased to be a man who suffered whispers. He had become a man who sought the anatomy of death. Émile began lingering over corpses longer than was customary, refusing to release them to grieving families until he had completed his observations. He recorded, with scientific precision, the moment breath ceased, the color of lips, the stiffening of limbs, yet his true focus lay elsewhere, the interval between silence and the first whisper. At precisely 3 minutes the murmur began, he wrote of one case. Low, male, imploring. The body's mouth did not move, yet I felt the words brush the inside of my ear. He pressed stethoscopes to skulls, set glass funnels to mouths, even placed his own ear against cold lips. Still the whispers came only to him, he concluded bitterly. No tool of man can seize them. They belong to another register of existence, blood and memory. Émile developed a theory. that blood itself carried memory, that in death it released fragments of thought like vapors rising from spoiled wine. To test it, he collected vials from his patients, storing them in stoppered jars. Jacques, horrified, begged him to stop, but Emile persisted, heating the samples, whispering questions into the bubbling red. In one chilling entry he recorded, "When flame touched the blood of Elise, I heard her voice again, clearer than ever. Do not let him near my sister." The theory grew in his mind until he wrote, "If thought persists in blood, then perhaps in my own veins I carry not only my voice, but the whispers of those before me." The silent chamber. He began constructing what he called La Chambre du Silence in the cellar of his home. Thick drapes smothered sound, and he lined the walls with cork to trap every vibration. Inside, he laid his journals, his vials, and the instruments of his practice. There, he conducted his most dreadful tests, remaining alone with corpses for hours, listening, ingesting drops of patient blood mixed with wine, sleeping on the tables where bodies had lain, waiting for whispers to intrude upon his dreams. He recorded visions that came to him, streets he had never walked, faces he had never known, crimes committed long before his time. Jacques' revolt. Jacques' loyalty fractured. He wrote secretly to a cousin in Lyon, "I fear Mastrou Letourneau descends into sorcery. He stains his hands not with medicine, but with the filth of the grave. If he is not stopped, he will bring ruin upon all who remain near him." One night Jacques confronted his master, demanding he destroy the chamber and abandon the experiments. Emile, pale and trembling, whispered, "It is not I who seek them. It is they who seek me. If I cease, they will not." The quarrel nearly came to blows. From that night forward, Jacques avoided the cellar altogether. The whisper in the glass. Perhaps the most terrifying note appears in a fragment, its edges singed as though Jacques himself had tried to burn it. Emile describes peering into a jar of preserved tissue when a voice whispered from within, "You are next." He dropped the jar, shattering it across the floor. The fragments of flesh slid across the tiles like worms. He wrote afterward, "The dead no longer merely confess, they threat the phantom of his father." Amid these experiments, one voice grew dominant. His father's, always the same refrain, "Not water, earth, find me." Emile began to believe that his own blood carried the echo of his father's death, that the inheritance of whispers was bound within his lineage. He searched parish records, interviewed aging villagers, bribed sextons for access to graves. The trail led nowhere concrete, yet the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it drowned out the others. The descent. By late spring, Emile no longer resembled a man of science. His hands shook, his eyes darted, his coat was perpetually stained. Colleagues avoided him, families whispered. He had become a necromancer. Children fled when they saw him in the street. And still he returned nightly to the silent chamber, journal in hand, ears straining. "They have chosen me as their scribe," he wrote, "but soon I fear they will demand I become their mouth." Toward the abyss, the experiments had not brought him peace. They had sharpened the voices, emboldened. They no longer whispered only in death. They intruded while he operated, while he ate, while he prayed. Emile felt the boundary of his own mind thinning, like parchment stretched too tight. And as summer approached, the whispers promised revelation. Soon, they murmured, "You will see." By the summer of 1887, Emile Letourneau's descent had slipped beyond the confines of private journals. His theories, once hidden in candlelit margins, now surfaced in medical discourse. He began presenting them first in whispers to colleagues, then in outright declarations to the shock of those around him. The treatise. He prepared a manuscript, nearly 100 pages, titled De la persistance de la voix humaine après la mort. In it he described his belief that the human body carried what he called le résidu vocal, the residue of voice. He argued that just as lungs could hold air after death, so too did nerves and blood vessels carry remnants of thought, like faint currents in a severed wire. His manuscript included case studies of patients who had whispered to him post-mortem, drawings of blood vessels mapped like rivers, annotated with words such as mémoire and souvenir, notes of experiments in his silent chamber, transcribed with unwavering seriousness. To his mind, this was not madness. It was discovery. The Paris lecture. In July, Emile secured an opportunity to present his findings before a small medical society in Paris. Jacques begged him not to go, insisting it would end in humiliation. But Emile, hollow-eyed and feverish, declared, "They must know. This is the future of medicine." The lecture was a disaster. He began with composure, speaking of nerve impulses and the retention of sensation, but as he warmed, his words shifted. He spoke of blood speaking in whispers, of spirits trapped in tissue, of his father's command that he unearth hidden truths. Eyewitnesses later recalled his face glistening with sweat, his voice trembling as he described a jar that had threatened him. The room fell silent. Then came laughter. A senior physician rose, declaring, "This is not science. This is superstition dressed in anatomy." Emile fled before the meeting ended, his reputation in ruins. Letters of warning. Within weeks, rumors spread across Paris. The provincial surgeon who drank blood, who listened at corpses' mouths, who claimed ghosts guided his scalpel. Families refused his services. Clergy denounced him. Colleagues severed ties. Jacques, increasingly frantic, wrote again to his cousin, "The master is undone. He is hounded by mockery and yet presses on. He speaks not to the living, but only to the dead. His nights are filled with mutterings. His soul darkens by the day." The inheritance of whispers. Amid this collapse, Emile clung more fiercely to one belief, that the ability to hear belonged not to him alone, but to his family line. He scoured parish archives, tracing his lineage back 3 generations. Strange patterns emerged. A grandfather who died raving of voices in the dark, an uncle who vanished after digging in consecrated ground, a mother who in her last fever begged that the voices stop. In the margins of his journal, Emile wrote, "It is no gift, it is no curse, it is blood, it is heredity." The failed operation. In August, a wealthy family begged him to operate on their son despite the scandal. Desperate for redemption, Emile agreed, but in the middle of the surgery, as his scalpel hovered, the voices rose in a deafening chorus. They shouted warnings, accusations, prayers. He froze, trembling, and dropped his blade. Blood spilled uncontrolled. The boy died within minutes. Emile collapsed beside the table, covering his ears, muttering, "Too many, too many." The family, horrified, dragged Jacques from the room, and vowed never to speak of it publicly, but word spread nonetheless, further blackening his name. The isolation. By autumn, Emile lived almost entirely in the silent chamber. Neighbors reported seeing only dim light from his cellar windows, groceries spoiled on his doorstep, parish bells tolled with no response from his house. Inside, he recorded, "They have ceased to whisper, only of themselves. They whisper of me. They say I am there. They say, my death is but another beginning." The fractured mind. In late September, Emile ceased writing in full sentences. His journal became half-words, jagged scrawls, drawings of open mouths, and Jacques found pages nailed to the walls, ink dripping like blood, each repeating the same phrase, "Not water, earth, find me." Jacques confessed in his final surviving letter, "I fear he is no longer master, nor even man. He is vessel. The house groans with voices at night. I dare not descend the stairs." The approach of winter. The year waned. The doctor who once healed bodies now lingered among shadows, speaking only to phantoms. He had lost patience, profession, and peace. Only the whispers remained, and in the deep silence of the chamber, they promised him a final revelation, one that would bind his fate to theirs forever. Winter of 1887 fell heavy upon Saint-Étienne. Snow buried the streets, and the river froze in silence. Yet inside the house of Emile Letourneau, silence did not exist. The whispers had grown constant, a swarm of unseen mouths. The last journal. The first pages of his final journal are still legible. They begin with confession. "I am not a physician. I am a scribe. They dictate, I obey." He described how the voices no longer lingered faintly at the edge of hearing. They pressed close, as if lips grazed his ear. They told him of crimes in the town, of lovers' betrayals, of infants buried beneath hearthstones. Some details proved true, others could not be verified. But the most dreadful were those that spoke not of the past, but of what was yet to come. Tomorrow the widow Belen will be struck by falling timber, he recorded. The next day, a beam collapsed in a carpenter's yard, killing her instantly. The whispers were no longer mournful. They were prophetic. Jacques' return. Jacques, after weeks away in fear, returned in December. He found the doctor gaunt, eyes rimmed red, lips cracked from muttering through the night. "Master," Jacques begged, "you must end this. Burn the journals. Leave this place. Let the dead rest." Emile only smiled faintly and said, "The dead do not rest. Why should I?" That night, Jacques crept into the silent chamber, intent on destroying the jars of blood and the pages nailed to the walls. But as he reached for a candle, he froze. From the shadows rose a chorus, faint but unmistakable, his own name, whispered by a dozen mouths. Jacques fled in terror, swearing never to return. The ritual. Alone, Emile descended deeper into his obsession. He began arranging bones from dissections into patterns upon the floor. He boiled blood, catching the steam in glass funnels, inhaling as though it were incense. He placed mirrors at the corners of the chamber, convinced reflections trapped fragments of the voices. The culmination came one frigid night when he scrawled this entry: "I will lie upon the table as they command. If the blood of others speaks, then mine shall be a torrent. Tonight, the veil will part." Neighbors later claimed they saw his windows pulse with light, though no candle or fire was lit. Some swore they heard voices echoing beneath the snow like a congregation chanting underground. The apparition, according to fragments preserved by Jacques, who lingered outside in fear, Emile was heard screaming, not in pain but in awe. He shouted his father's name. He cried, "I see you." Then came silence. When Jacques dared enter the house at dawn, he found the chamber in ruins, mirrors shattered, blood jars broken, the floor slick with red. The table lay overturned, and upon the wall, written in his master's own hand, was a message scrawled in blood. "The earth has spoken." He was never in water. He was buried alive. The vanishing, but Emile himself was gone. His coat hung upon its hook. His boots stood by the cellar door. His body was nowhere. Only the journals remained, pages curling in the frost, ink smeared with sweat and blood. The town searched for days, combing rivers, forests and fields. No trace was found. Some whispered he had taken his own life. Others swore he had been claimed by the very dead he served. But a handful, Jacques among them, knew the truth was darker. Emile had crossed the veil. The legacy of whispers. In the weeks after, neighbors reported strange sounds from the empty house. A woman claimed she heard her dead husband call her name when she passed the gate. A child swore he saw pale faces at the cellar window. Authorities sealed the property, yet the legend endured, that within those walls the voices still lingered, waiting for another physician to listen, and always, in every account, the same refrain, a whisper scratching faintly at the ear. Not water, earth. The story of Emile Letourneau had reached its climax. His fate was no longer that of a man, but of something bound to death itself. And yet, the tale was not finished, for what comes after the vanishing is perhaps more chilling still. The disappearance of Dr. Emile Letourneau in the winter of 1887 did not close his story. It widened. What followed in the months after his vanishing was stranger still. Events that left the town of Saint-Étienne branded with a quiet dread, and Jacques with a terror he carried to his grave. The house reopened. By spring, parish officials forced Jacques to return to the shuttered. He resisted, claiming the cellar still murmured in the night, but threats of arrest compelled him. 2 gendarmes accompanied him, lanterns in hand, and together they broke the seal upon the cellar door. The chamber was worse than memory. The broken jars had blackened, their contents dried into brittle flakes like ash. The bones Emile arranged lay scattered. Though not in disorder, they formed circles, symbols crude yet deliberate. Most unsettling was the table. Its surface bore no dust. Though the house had stood empty all winter, the wood gleamed faintly, as if someone or something still lay upon it. The hidden drawer. While the gendarme muttered prayers, Jacques noticed a drawer in the table he had never seen. Within lay a final sheaf of papers. These were not journals but transcripts, written in Emile's hand yet labeled with names of the dead. Each contained confessions, thefts, adulteries, murders. One bore the title, The Burial of Henri Letourneau. It told in detail how Emile's father had been placed not in water, as the family believed, but beneath earth, while still drawing breath. A conspiracy of two men was named, neighbors who had feuded with him, both long dead by the time Emile wrote. The account ended chillingly. He scratches still, the digging, the parish, half out of morbid curiosity and half to silence rumor, allowed an exhumation. Henri Letourneau's coffin was raised from the cemetery. When opened, the truth froze all present. The skeleton's fingers were worn to bone. The lid of the coffin bore deep gouges, carved by desperate nails. His jaw hung open in a silent scream. Whispers spread like fire through Saint-Étienne. Emile had not lied. He had heard his father's true voice, carried beyond death. The contagion of whispers. In the weeks after the exhumation, strange reports multiplied. A midwife claimed she heard the infants she lost cry again in her arms. A grave digger swore he heard singing beneath the soil. Even the parish priest admitted, in private, that while delivering mass, he heard a voice behind him reciting the prayers with dreadful precision, though no one stood there. Jacques himself confessed to hearing Emile in his dream, not the man, but his voice, calm and persuasive. Right, Jacques, take up the journal, continue the work. He burned his bedding and fled the town. The inquiry, news of these events reached Paris. A commission of physicians and clergy visited Saint-Étienne, determined to prove hysteria. They examined the silent chamber, dismissing its bones as medical refuse, its stains as ordinary rot. But when they opened Emile's final journal for evidence, each man paled, not because of the words but because the ink was still wet. One physician swore it smudged beneath his thumb. Another declared the pages warm to the touch. They sealed the journal and carried it away. But within a week their offices in Paris burned mysteriously. The journal was never recovered. The final rumor. As for Emile, no body was ever found. Yet in taverns and among washerwomen at the river, one story persisted, that a man in a blood-stained coat was seen wandering the cemetery at night, head bowed, as if listening to the ground. Children swore they heard footsteps in the abandoned house. Merchants avoided the lane entirely. By 1890 the property was demolished. Yet even then, workers reported faint murmurs beneath the rubble. The truth had come full circle. Emile's obsession had revealed that the dead were not silent, and his own disappearance blurred the line between their world and ours. But what happened in the final winter, in that chamber of blood and bone, remained a mystery no living witness could fully tell. And so the whispers lingered, waiting for the last part of the tale. The case of Dr. Emile Letourneau did not end with his disappearance in the winter. What followed was not resolution, but a slow spreading of unease, as though his silence had seeded something that would not die. The collapse of Jacques. Jacques fled Saint-Étienne after the exhumation of Henri Letourneau. He took refuge with his cousin in Lyon, but peace did not follow him. In letters that survive, his handwriting falters into near illegibility. I cannot sleep. At night I hear him, the master, calling me from the cellar. Sometimes he whispers my name. Sometimes he repeats words I once spoke to him. They are my own phrases, yet they return twisted, echoed from a mouth I cannot see. Within a year Jacques vanished as well. His cousin found his room locked, the window open, the bed empty. Upon the desk lay a final note, smudged with sweat. I am going down to join him. I cannot bear the silence. The parish haunted. Saint-Étienne did not recover quickly. Families avoided the lane where Letourneau's house once stood, though the rubble had long been cleared. Parish priests conducted exorcisms in whispered tone. Yet even during mass, faint interruptions sometimes echoed in the nave. A cough where no one sat. A whispered amen that chilled the congregation. Old women swore the voices spread like disease. From year to year, from house to house, young men drank themselves senseless to block them out. By 1892 the town had lost nearly a third of its population to flight. The vanishing journals. The last confirmed sighting of Emile's journals occurred in Paris, within the offices of the medical commission. After the fire destroyed those chambers, no trace remained. Yet a rumor clung stubbornly, that a single volume survived, passed secretly between doctors who dared to read it. One such rumor claimed the book was consulted during the First World War, when field surgeons in the trenches swore they heard the dying speak long after their mouths had closed. Another whispered it lay in the library of a private asylum outside Tours, where patients were said to mimic the voices of the dead with uncanny precision. None of these stories were ever verified. The whisper that persists, even now long after the doctor's time. Fragments of his legend survive. In rural France there are still tales of physicians who hear too much, who wake from sleep certain that patients long buried are calling their names. They say the gift or curse of hearing did not die with Letourneau. It passed like a seed, carried in blood, waiting for ears willing to listen. And there are houses where, if you press your ear to the walls, you might swear they murmur, not the moan of wind, not the settling of timber, but syllables, names, dates, confessions, echoes of lives that refuse to fall silent. The final warning, the last entry attributed to Emile, scrawled in a hand unsteady and stained, is short. Scholars argue whether it is authentic, or whether Jacques wrote it in madness. Regardless, its words linger. They do not fade. They do not forget. They only wait for someone else to listen. And so the tale of Dr. Emile Letourneau closes, not with his death, but with the possibility that even now somewhere, his whispers continue. If one evening you find yourself alone in a darkened room and feel a breath against your ear, though no one stands behind you, remember Emile, remember the doctor, who first dared to listen, and ask yourself, is it truly your own thoughts you hear, or the voices of those who refuse to be silent? They are still waiting.